Hey guys, it's Libby. Welcome to the Bard Book Club. Today we are talking about Coriolanus. I have no plans. I have no strategy. At some point, I'm definitely gonna mix up Cominius and Menenius. Let's just get into it. This is one of the, in my opinion, undeservedly lesser known plays by Shakespeare. So I'm gonna start off with a fair bit of context. First, Roman context, then Shakespearean context. So this is set in the early days of the Republic, which is not a period in Rome's history that is particularly present in the modern consciousness. So you kind of have to set aside the concepts you have of Rome, which are late Republic and imperial. So Coriolanus was probably a real dude. Some scholars contest this, but we do have writings by multiple Roman historians from a later date about Coriolanus, and also a lot of history from before 390 BCE was destroyed in an attack on Rome. So the fact that we don't have history about him from his period is unsurprising. So two of the most important writers about Coriolanus were Livy and Plutarch, who Shakespeare was definitely reading and drawing on when he was writing his play. Plutarch, interestingly, wrote about Coriolanus in his Parallel Lives, which is a collection of biographies, first one of a Greek and then one of a Roman, and he sort of invites you to compare them. The Greek that Coriolanus is paired with is Alcibiades, and if you know about him, I expect you find that fascinating. So if you don't know about him, maybe go read a bit about Alcibiades and then look at the story of Coriolanus with that in mind. I think you'll enjoy it. So we are in the 5th century BCE, which is actually the same time that Alcibiades was alive over in Greece. We're also in the time of classical Athens. So Plato, Socrates, Aeschylus, those people are big. But Rome is still a little baby. We think of Rome as like a giant empire, or at least as the entirety of the Italian peninsula. At this point, Rome is basically just a city with some outlying farmlands. And so the Volscians are another group of people who are pretty close in proximity to them that they are battling for, local control with. And in this story, the Roman kingdom is still in living memory, although we have now moved into the Republic. So the Republic, as you can tell, hasn't really figured itself all the way out yet, and we're still making some adjustments. And the governmental structure of the Republic is pretty key to understanding this play. So to start off with the social structure, you have 3 social classes. Lowest one is the slaves. The slaves do not get to be in this play. Then you have the plebeians, who are free citizens but not wealthy. They're not members of the aristocracy. And then you have the aristocracy, which is known as the patricians. Shakespeare doesn't really use these words. He uses citizens for plebeians, and he often uses the word senator or lord to talk about patricians. The government consists of senators who come from the patrician class. They work together to govern the city. And there are also 2 consuls. Consuls were kind of like the executives. You only served as consul for 1 year at a time. So you could serve as consul multiple times, but your term was limited to 1 year. You had 2 at a time to provide a check on each other. Well, this isn't actually relevant here, but when we get to Julius Caesar, it will be relevant. Sometimes, if there was a state of emergency, they would suspend normal government practices and appoint a dictator who could serve for 6 months to solve the problem, and then he had to step down at the end of 6 months. At the very beginning of this play, off stage in fact, we have a change in the structure of government, and that is the appointing of 5 tribunes, who are members of the patrician class, but they are in the Senate to be representatives of the plebeians. They are the plebeian voice in the Senate. Previously, the plebeians had no representation. We only get to see 2 of the tribunes in this play because 5 of them would just be crowding the stage, and they didn't have that many actors. So we do what we need to do for this story with just 2 of them. Now, taking a look at the context within Shakespeare's work, Coriolanus holds the perhaps august, depending on how you feel about it, position of Shakespeare's last tragedy. Unless you count Two Noble Kinsmen as a tragedy, that play does not really fit into genre very well. So this is probably his last tragedy. And what seems to be going on with Shakespeare as he matures as a playwright is that he gets better at acknowledging that the world is complicated. And so his plays reflect the complexity of the world more and more, or go the opposite route, like the romances. So Coriolanus was probably published after Pericles, which is his first romance, and then right after Coriolanus came his other great romances, Winter's Tale, Tempest, and Cymbeline. And the romances are all highly fantastical. So Shakespeare is saying you can have neat, simple, very satisfying storylines. We just have to acknowledge that this is a fiction. In his tragedies and city comedies, Measure for Measure, you get more of a sense that knowing what's wrong or right is really hard. Knowing who's the good guy and who's the bad guy, does that even mean anything? In earlier tragedies like Hamlet and Othello, we know who's the good guy and who's the bad guy. As we move later through the tragedies, that becomes harder and harder. Is Macbeth a good guy? Is King Lear a good guy? Is Timon of Athens a good guy? In some ways. And then Coriolanus is kind of the height of that situation. Kind of everybody is a bad guy. So who are the characters we could potentially be looking up to here? Obviously, we've got Coriolanus. And when he first comes on stage, he's certainly quite a presence. He's probably loud. He may be wearing armor, which, is pretty. And also we know that he is the title character of this play, so we may be thinking, oh, this is supposed to be our heroic guy that we look up to, but then he's just really unpleasant. He's a hard guy to like. I don't know what all the people who like him see in him. Then to contrast, we could contrast him to Menenius, perhaps, who's representing a sort of different kind of manhood, a different kind of being a person and being in a position of power. He's much less violent than Coriolanus, but what he does in scene 1 is show up, listen to a bunch of poor people say that they are starving and that they need access to the corn, which exists, but that they are not allowed to have. And Menenius says, look, I get that you guys are hungry, but you are also dumb, so maybe just shut up about it. Shakespeare said that a bit more eloquently in his, a parable of the belly, which we will get to in a bit. Probably, I don't have a plan, we might totally forget about it. But that's basically what he's saying. And so then the other source of political power that's being represented here is the tribunes, who I, as a lover of democracy, kind of want to root for, and I think they are, in fact, the closest thing we have to a good guy, although I acknowledge that I am saying that as a lover of democracy, and that is perhaps not what Shakespeare intended. So they recognize that Coriolanus would be a really bad consul, and they don't want him to be the consul, because he would be bad for the people that they represent. But they use these really oily political tactics and mob control that, also makes them hard to like. So who are we rooting for in this play? I don't know. It's complicated, just like real life. If you want a fairy tale, go watch Pericles. But if you want, to actually think about problems, and admittedly not come to conclusions, Coriolanus, baby. So let's take a look at that first scene. It's a little bit different than your typical Shakespearean opening scene, or at least opening image. Sometimes the very first thing, the thing that is labeled as scene 1, contains multiple, sets of conversations. But so normally we expect to see a private scene that then either opens into public, or scene 2 is a public scene. Scene 1 in this play is a public scene. We are in the streets, we are with the ensemble, if you will. But what's interesting in this situation is that there appears to be a parallel scene happening somewhere else in the city. They talk about how there's two groups of peasants, they're not peasants, they're citizens, rising up, and we are with one group, but all of the interesting stuff, as it turns out, is happening with the other group. With the other group, we have Menenius, is Cominius there? I can't remember. Coriolanus, and that is where they announce that the plebeians will be represented by tribunes. So that's where the tribunes are appointed. And so we don't get to see any of that. We get to see a surprisingly eloquent citizen number one. Yeah, citizen number one is really quite good at the rhetoric. I don't know, put him in charge of something. And it is definitely a him, I regret to say. So they are not part of the actual events that are relevant to the story. And then halfway through scene one, we get the story arriving from the other end of the city. Who's to say if Shakespeare intended this, but I certainly interpret this as the sort of first instance of demonstrating how complicated real life is. Sometimes you are not at the important scene. Sometimes you don't really get the first-hand information. Sometimes there's a bunch of other complicated stuff happening that you're not aware of, and you only find out about it afterwards, and you still gotta live and make choices and figure out how stuff works if you're lucky. And in this first scene, on several occasions, we encounter what is sort of the key image of this play, which is the human body. So we get it in Menenius's, sometimes I say Menenius, sometimes I say Menenius, you never know what's gonna happen, in his belly speech, where he talks about, the patricians are the belly, which distribute the food via the blood. Don't worry too much about the medical implications of that, to the rest of the body parts. Second citizen tells us, they say, poor suitors have strong breaths. They shall know we have strong arms too. Menenius compares one of the citizens to a big toe, and various body parts are used in more idiomatic phrases for their synecdochal or metonymic value. I just made up some adjectives. For example, Titus Lartius, thou shalt see me strike once more at Tullus' face. He's not literally talking about Tullus's face. Marked you his lip and eyes. Lots of enumeration of body parts. Which brings us to an interesting point about this play. It's so focused on the human body, and yet it is surprisingly unsexual. And we know that Shakespeare was fully capable of employing sexual innuendo. He does it in just about all of his other plays. I often find myself explaining dirty jokes as part of the Bard Book Club. By my count, there are 2 moments that employ body imagery as sexual imagery in this entire play. First, it's quite abstract. It's totally understandable if you miss it, is Coriolanus storming Corioli by himself, or perhaps I should say Caius Marcius, as he was then, storming Corioli by himself. So there's gates in front of the city. He, in his manliness, breaches the gates. They actually close up behind him, and he goes in, goes crazy, does his thing, and when he comes out, they talk about how he is covered in blood. So this breach of a closed city is actually often used as a metaphor for in order to make you think of the rape that often goes along with war and siege warfare and the breaching of a city. And then all this blood on Coriolanus is going with the blood from the rupture of the hymen. And then you've also got Coriolanus talking about his wounds. And he uses the language of prostitution to talk about how he feels about displaying his wounds to the people. When Cominius is going to praise Coriolanus's feats in battle to the Senate, to the other patricians, Coriolanus is present and he says, I had rather have one scratch on my head in the sun when the alarm were struck than idly sit to hear my nothings monstered. If if you've been paying attention to these Bard Book Club videos, you will know that nothing is slang for vagina. So he's equating the wounds that he has with sexual orifices. And he, in order to become a consul, has to stand in the marketplace, talk to the citizens, and they have to voice their support for him. And part of what he needs to do to like show that he is worthy to be a consul is demonstrate, is to show the wounds he has received on behalf of Rome. He really doesn't want to do this because like standing in a public place, exposing holes in your body is the act of a prostitute. And that discussion brings us to Elizabethan concepts of gender, which is very present in this play because the gender and the body are all mixed up with each other in a whole big mess. So I tried to explain this in my last Bard Book Club video. I did a terrible job of it, but I have come up with a better way of doing it. So, Elizabethan concepts of gender, or early modern concepts of gender, and how they differ from our concepts of gender. So, at this precise moment, our concepts of gender are in flux, and like we may just throw out the whole concept, who knows? But let's say late 20th century concepts of gender were pretty much male, female. Those are our two things. Those are the two things that there are. Early modern people also had an idea of there being two things. However, the things were male and not male, as opposed to male and female. And there were all sorts of things you could do in order to get put in the not male category. Obviously, being a woman was one of those. Being prepubescent, also one of them. Being old, one of them. Being a eunuch, definitely. Doing other various feminine things. Crying appears to be one of those, mentioned both in this play and King Lear. There's probably some other stuff. Being able to be in the man category or in the male category, I think deep down it has to do with like being able to impregnate people. And so anything that is going to prevent that is going to kick you out of the man category. Another central tenet of this male category is the idea of having a classical male body, which is closed. A closed body, which things do not move into or out of, unlike women who have stuff just moving in and out of their body all the times. Ew. And the reason that it's bad, or at least unmanly, and man is kind of associated with good, the reason it's bad to have things moving in and out of your body is because it means your body is not complete, and you want to have a complete body. So if something comes out of your body, then you don't have it anymore, and so you're not complete. And if something is able to move into your body, then either you have a foreign thing inside of you, which is not part of you, or it means you had some flaw before which was able to be addressed by some outside thing, and neither of that stuff is good. And I do suspect that tied up into this is the idea of disease entering through bodily orifices. And so like disease, obviously a thing you don't want to have inside you, and people thought of disease as entering through the air, so through the nose and the mouth. By Shakespeare's day, I think they had a concept of what venereal disease was as well, and so you can also get it that way. And so one of the conflicts in this play is whether or not wounds received in war count as these orifices and these violations of the classical male body, or whether they are not. They are manly because they show your martial competence and your butchness. So Coriolanus clearly thinks that like these wounds are a feminizing aspect of him, or at least a demasculinizing aspect of him, and so he does not want to show them publicly. Guys, it's a secret that I have holes in my body, don't let anybody know. Whereas his mother and Menenius clearly think the opposite, and they almost like fetishize the wounds he has. So like are keeping precise count of them, and like, ooh, he got this one wound from this time and this other wound from this time, and aren't all of his scars so great? We should all have more of them. And this absolutely unflinching desire for the classical male body that is complete in and of itself and has no porous openings that Coriolanus has is his flaw, if we want to look at this in a pseudo-Aristotelian sense. I think a lot of people misinterpret Aristotle when they use him to analyze tragedy, but the misinterpretation is still useful, so I'm going to use it. And note that in Act 2, Scene 1, which I think is a very revealing scene, and that it has almost nothing to do with advancing the plot, at least before the ladies enter. It's just a scene of Menenius being a total dick to the Tribunes, and he just spends like 3 pages, almost 100 lines, insulting them. And one of the insults he issues at them is sort of painting this picture of when they are attempting to do their government duties, what actually happens is they have like horrific diarrhea. So the play is like taking Coriolanus's opinion that anything moving into or out of the body is bad. Every image we have of things moving in and out of bodies is bad. Like I said, that one like image we have of sex with Coriolanus entering the city of Corioli, it's described as rape, the bad version of sex, as you may have heard. Ooh, I lied. There is actually one more sexual image. It comes from Aufidius. He says that once he and Coriolanus have united forces in Act 4, Scene 5, that they will pour war into the bowels of ungrateful Rome. So we're getting another like war-rape conflation metaphor. Coriolanus talks about how the plebeians smell bad and they infect his air. So when he breathes, he has to take them into his body, and now he has them inside him. Ew. But this is a flaw because it doesn't actually work. You can't actually live like this successfully. You can't just stop caring about your mom. And Aufidius, in addition to Coriolanus, has also been inducted into this cult of the classical male body, if you will. And so that is what he admires in Coriolanus. That is why he likes fighting him, because he's like, oh, I actually get to fight a real man. And that is why he wants him to join him. And then when it is revealed that Coriolanus cannot live up to his standards, Aufidius decides that he must die. And the way that Coriolanus dies is multiple stab wounds, multiple things entering his body, as opposed to like strangulation or having his throat slit. And so if we don't think about it very hard, we can interpret this as Aufidius winning. He is the only classical male left, and thus he is on top. But could you like remind me, was it the Volscians who ate the entire Mediterranean in the first couple centuries of the first millennium? Or was it the Romans? I can't remember. Aufidius is not, he is the winner of the battle of this play. He is not the winner of the war. The Volscians are going to be defeated. Aufidius, whatever you got going on, it's not good enough. It's not working. Oh, one more thing that is related to this, I have mentioned this in other plays. I think definitely when we talk about Hotspur in Henry IV Part 1, this sort of hyper masculinity is tied to homosexuality in this play. Coriolanus has like way more sexual tension with Aufidius than he has with his wife, who he like seems to ignore to the maximum extent possible. There's also other homosocial / homosexual moments in Act 1, Scene 6, when Cominius sees Coriolanus after the wars. Coriolanus says, oh, let me clip ye, in my arms as sound as when I wooed, in heart as merry as when our nuptial day was done, and tapers burnt to bedward. And nowadays, the social imagining of gay men is men who are expressing femininity. I'm not saying that gay men are actually men expressing femininity, but this is how like a fundamentally heteronormative society this is what it needs to do in order to understand male homosexuality. That was an interpretation of male homosexuality in the early modern period, but there's also the hyper-masculine version of homosexuality, which was where you are so manly and so like about manly things that you cannot have women enter into the sphere at all, even as sexual partners, and so your only sexual partners can be male. And I'd like to wrap up the discussion of Coriolanus by tying it to the modern day, which is not something I typically do on the Bard Book Club, but I think Coriolanus is particularly well suited to being tied to kind of any other era that's thinking about how government should do, and also what do we do with soldiers, and also what do we do with men. In Act 3, Scene 1, in one of his many tirades against poor people and how they smell bad and should not have representation in government, Coriolanus says, "It makes the consuls base, and my soul aches to know when two authorities are up, neither supreme, how soon confusion may enter twixt the gap of both, and take the one by the other," which really reminded me of a comment I had recently seen from the CEO of Uber when asked about the policies in his company that made it difficult for workers to unionize. He said, "The union becomes another power center, and it makes things very difficult for the company." Yeah, I bet it does. So that's it for Coriolanus. Thank you, Will, for joining me in the discussion. Thank you for watching. Next month is going to be Twelfth Night. Now, in my discussion of Twelfth Night, I am going to be talking about the sonnets of both Shakespeare and Petrarch. So if you are totally unfamiliar with those, I would either read the Wikipedia page or read a couple examples of each of their sonnets just so you get a better idea of what I'm talking about. Okay, enjoy. Happy Thanksgiving to my American viewers. Happy Thursday to other viewers. If I get this up on Thursday, which don't know why I'm assuming that. Okay, see you later. Bye.